Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where this week we began a brand new reading plan, and we're going to take a deep dive in a single section of today's reading and examine a single question that the passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Jay Rivenbark, and we're looking at a passage from Matthew chapter 2, and I'm going to read a piece of that passage. So this is concerning the birth of Jesus, beginning in verse 13 of Matthew 2. It says, "After the wise men were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. 'Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother,' the angel said. 'Stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him.' That night Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet, 'I called my son out of Egypt.' Herod was furious when he realized that the wise man had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are dead." Matthew alludes early and often to Old Testament scripture. Here he references, earlier he references the genealogy of Jesus, which we talked about yesterday. In verse 6, he's quoting Micah chapter 5, verse 2. In verse 15, he's quoting Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And then verse 18 is Jeremiah 31 and 15. And so he's dealing with the flight to Egypt. So Egypt is a Gentile country, but the Christian readers are primarily thinking in terms of Israel's history. It has always been a place of persecution for the people of Israel, or excuse me, a refuge for persecuted people. And it makes it clear his interest here is that he's talking about the plan and the hand of God over Jesus' destiny. God's guidance alone saves this single child. God is so inclined to work on this. And the focus is on the child and his mother. Joseph is kind of this agent to guide, to lead, to be the protector, if you will. And they go at night. You know, there's so many pieces to this that we could spend talking about. But he talks about how that God himself is speaking this word. It becomes clear that God is speaking, and we get this important information about how God is speaking in this passage. And so the exodus from Egypt is repeated and fulfilled in Jesus. So that's kind of the context. So the children of Israel in Egypt, they leave, go to the promised land. Here we find Jesus exiled essentially in Egypt and returning back to the promised land. That's often how these people are reading it. Or they could be reading it that this is the Son of God. You know, they may be understanding it that way. But then we have the murder of the children. And I'm trying to see if I put it in my notes, but something dawned on me in some reading. Because I think in the context of cities, you know, because we live in a town, you know, that's relatively small. But if you killed, even in our town, all of the children who were 2 years old and older, that would be an enormous amount of people.
A lot of folk.
But having visited Israel and seen where these places were, they were very, very, what they called a city would have been small. I mean, a city could have been 300 people. You know, it wouldn't have been a large number of people. And I read something that said the reason why he was able to pull this off is because we're probably talking about 15 to 20, maybe 25 max children who were killed. I don't know.
Yeah, there's no way of knowing. That's an interesting point. Having been and seen, you're like, okay, it was probably tighter,
Right.
much more so than what maybe you think just reading. He does note all the boys in and around.
Right.
We don't know how far that around circumference pushed out either. So, it's hard to really get a handle. One was too many.
That's right.
But we don't necessarily know.
But it kind of reveals to us a little bit about Herod, who is this tyrant. He's an evil person. You think about that concept. It's hard for us to grasp that. Okay, we're just going to pick this age and we're going to go kill some people. And it's not a harmless matter, because we're talking. He goes back and talks about Rachel weeping for her children and Ramah, and Herod can't be the argument is Herod can't be a true king of the Jews if he's killing their children. That's what Matthew. That's a piece of what Matthew's trying to argue. But he keeps bringing these scriptures up from the Old Testament, whether it's Micah or Hosea or Jeremiah, all of which I think go to help him make the point that he's trying to make, that Jesus is the Messiah. And what you have been reading goes to what I am writing. And so why are these fulfillments of prophecy so integral to the legitimacy of the New Testament? These things that he quotes, why are they so important?
Well, they're pieces of the puzzle that validate, I think you used the word legitimize early on, the truth of Scripture, because these prophecies occurred depending on the prophet and the time frame, hundreds of years prior to, and then they become fulfilled specifically later on. And he's intentional, it seems, to draw those out so that you're like, oh, okay, I see that. This isn't just an event that happened. It's one thing for him to note the, quote, historical event that it happened. But then when he ties it to prophetic scripture hundreds of years ago, you have to step back and say, okay, there's something supernatural going on here for these things to occur this way.
I think if they just write this new gospel without pointing back to this is what was said and this is how it was fulfilled,
it doesn't have near the impact.
Especially to, the thing about it is, I don't know that it matters as much to us, right? But to the people he's writing to, it is ultra critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
He spends a lot of time, all of the writers of the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, don't point back the way Matthew does. Matthew seems to have a particular audience that he is trying to convince that Jesus is the Messiah.
Yeah, and for those people who knew Old Testament scripture and prophecies, was probably the best way for him to convince them, get them on board to make those tie-ins and connections for them. Rather than just saying, okay, he is, and I believe he is, then when he makes those connections, it would have been much more impactful for those people to say, okay, I do see it, I do get it. It does make sense.
Let me throw a curveball here, only because I'm in it and I want to address it. He does not seem to be bothered by the fact that God would allow innocent children to be killed to save his son. He doesn't even address it.
Right.
He doesn't even address, is this a problem? Yeah. Is God bothered by it? It's just like, this was God's plan, and we just have to accept that this is how God was going to make it work. But that's hard to swallow at times.
Oh, sure it is. He does neither. He neither says, God was going to accomplish it, therefore this was necessary, right, and don't worry about that. He'll take care of them, and et cetera, et cetera. Nor does he say, if Herod had been sensitive and not been the fool, this wouldn't have had to happen. He just reports.
That's right.
What it was. This was it. Goes back to, I think, yesterday's podcast where we talked about Scripture doesn't leave out the ugly stuff sometimes, and that's an ugly part of this. That's an ugly part of getting Jesus introduced,
and it had
for him to survive.
For this to be fulfilled, it had to happen.
Had to happen because there again, you're backing up hundreds of years prior when the prophecy was given.
Right, that Rachel's going to weep over the children who are dead. And I think it should give us one of the things that I especially as I was preparing specifically for this lesson and I was reading some commentators, it has to give me pause at times to things that I go, gosh, the devil is at work. You know, he is, oh my Lord, he is making inroads everywhere. You know, this is horrible. When in reality, it might be God's handiwork that's just moving some pieces around, because God, I don't want to, I can't go as far as to say God made this happen, but God allowed it for he said it was going to happen, and then he allowed it to happen.
Yeah. You know, going through this and looking at it from this lens and perspective, because if you don't, you don't think in that thought, you know, that the ugly sometimes is a part of the plan,
right?
You know, to get to the ultimate result. But it's caused me to step back some and look at my own life, you know, and I have at least two significant events in my life. I've got a lot of them, but two significant events that keep coming to my mind that in the time and the season which they occurred, I thought, where is God? Why has this happened? This is injustice. This is wrong treatment. But years removed from that, looking back, I'm never going to be at the place I'm at doing what I'm doing, having the perspective I have on things, had it not been for those. You know, now then, you know, to say, oh, well, that was God's plan all along, I don't know that. What I do know unequivocally is that as I responded to God in those times and seasons, then he worked something that I don't think would have ever come to pass otherwise. That's just the reality.
And I would agree with that. I sometimes people will go as far as to say, and I'm slightly uncomfortable at times going this far, well, this was God's plan. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
right.
I can't fully say that.
Yeah.
You know, because there are situations where I knew better. I could have avoided, you know, I could have changed the path. But what I can say is that God used it for my benefit and his glory.
Absolutely.
If I'm willing.
Yes.
That's the other piece of it.
Yeah,
you know, I gotta be willing. You know, because even in this story, if Joseph don't listen, guess who gets killed?
Yeah, I was gonna say if he don't
Jesus.
Yeah, if he don't move,
right.
You know, if it get up in the middle of the night, we got to go.
Right.
Then perhaps he gets killed. You know, he could have got down to Egypt, and they say, well, you know what? Nobody knows us. Here's a lot less pressure. We'll just hang out here.
That's right. We won't go back.
Then we don't go back. And so they all played an integral part. It was God's plan and provision, but they constantly had to be submissive to it.
I would agree. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Matthew.